Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Zoom and on Facebook. And we're just so delighted to have with us Eli Rosen, who was Rabbi Yoselle and the Yiddish consultant on the show Unorthodox. We were just chatting for a few moments, and I can say they must have kept you pretty busy during the whole filming of the show, considering how much Yiddish there is in the show and how many little details there are to recreate the Hasidic world.
And, yes. I was pretty busy during the filming of it, and before and after as well, with the writing and the coaching and the editing and the subtitles and so on and so forth.
And it's also just such I think an interesting time for us to have this program. I mean, this is why we chose it. We're just a few days before Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av, a day when we think about all of the calamities that befallen the Jewish people. But also a time when we think about the destruction of the temples, and we're taught that the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred between Jews. So this is a time to do the opposite, to think about Jewish unity, to think about understanding other segments of the Jewish world. And right, the Baal Shem Tov teaches that we are all as different limbs of the same body, that all the different parts of the Jewish world are truly interconnected. I think for many of us, the show Unorthodox was a window, a very powerful window, or the beginning of a window into another segment of the Jewish world, and one that does have similarities to our own. And that final scene where Esti sings the wedding song, I was thinking back to my own training as a rabbi, and I had to learn that melody and was tested on the melody, even if it wasn't in Yiddish. And the Yiddish language itself is so central to I think American Jews, wherever part of the Jewish world you are in. And on the other hand, it's very different. I got all kinds of phone calls from members of ours who said, you know, what's up with the payas? Or I didn't know that there were Jews who lived in that way. And it's just so important to think about it, to talk about it, and to learn from each other. And I see Eli Rosen in your role, someone who's really between the worlds, or a translator of those worlds, who is hired to translate the Hasidic world to a production team and the actors in Berlin. And also a perfect translator, someone who grew up in that world and ended up leaving it, and who now lives more in closer to our reality. So perfect translator of that world. So I'd like to thank the Herkes family for sponsoring this program, and I'm going to do a little bit of a formal bio. So raised in the Hasidic community of Borough Park, Brooklyn, Eli is a recovering corporate litigator who now serves as the managing director of New Yiddish Repertory Theater, as well as a Yiddish cultural consultant for film and television. Past theater credits include Waiting for Godot, Awake and Sing, the New York Times critics pick God of Vengeance, and Rhinoceros in his own critically acclaimed Yiddish translation, as well as his own one-man show, The Drunk Cantor, based on the monologues of Morris Schwartz. Film TV credits include the Neflix hit series Unorthodox, Minyan, Tzedekis, and The Binding of Itzik, which is upcoming. Eli is also a founding board member of Freedom, which provides social support and fosters community for the formerly ultra-Orthodox. Website is elirosen.net. So welcome again, everybody. We're going to be having a conversation this morning. And after the conversation, there'll be time for Q&A. I'm going to mute everybody for the duration of the conversation. But if you'd like to put in your questions into the chat, we can address them as we go along, or we can address them at the very end. So I believe, Eddie, that you're the host. Could you mind muting everybody except for Eli? All right. Actually, here we go.
Yeah, 1 sec.
Okay. It's okay. Just.
Oh, you just took the host.
There we go. So let me just find you, Eli. There we go. So this is my first question, right? There are so many details that went into making the show Unorthodox. The tone of the Yiddish, right? The length of the socks, every detail to recreate the world. And you were also the Rebbe in the show, but really you were the rabbi for the show. You were the consultant, the one who brought to life that whole world. So overall, from a philosophic point of view, what was overall most important for you to convey to the production team of Unorthodox?
I guess the same thing that was most important for me to convey to the general audience, which is that Hasidic people are three-dimensional, are human, have wants and desires and conflicts and stresses and just like everybody else. And there's this tendency, certainly in Hollywood, to reduce Hasidic people to caricatures that are incredibly ignorant and offensive, quite frankly, just like it would be for any other underrepresented minority. And luckily for us, in the last years, certainly, there's this movement toward more authenticity and better representation in art. And our creative team, the creators and writers, Anna Winger and Alexa Karolinsky, as well as the producers and the directors and so on, were all incredibly committed to making sure that this show did that it was representative, that it was authentic, that it was kind of an intimate and a faithful and a detailed portrayal of that world. To the extent possible, of course. It is fictionalized, it is television, it is dramatized, but it should present this sympathetic picture of these characters. And I think they were successful in doing so. I think all the characters are deeply flawed and deeply human and very relatable. You know, we all know people like that. And that message has been conveyed to us by viewers from all over the world, including, to the surprise of many, most of the Muslim majority Middle Eastern countries, not just Middle Eastern countries, but Muslim countries in general, including countries like Turkey and Singapore. We've received messages from all over the world saying that this is our world. Mm. We know these people. We can relate to these people. We received a tweet, rather somebody tweeted from Turkey in Turkish, saying that this is the first time they cried over somebody Jewish. And I mean, that's just incredible, no matter how you look at it. And that's really what has been lacking. And I'm really glad we were able to kind of fill that void.
There's so many powerful scenes that did exactly what you're talking about. You know, bringing it to life and making the characters feel so human and relatable. Is there one scene that you were most proud of from your point of view, from your role, or that took most effort to convey to the actors how to integrate and bring in the feeling of being a Hasidic person?
So many. I mean, in terms of the language and the dialect, in the beginning, and Shira has been constantly telling the press that I'm the only person who saw her dark side. I vehemently protest. She has no dark side. She is one of the nicest and sweetest people that I've ever met. It was an absolute joy to work with. And deserves every bit of kudos that she's getting. But there were stressful times at the beginning where they thought, this is absurd. We'll never be able to integrate this amount of Yiddish text, and we'll never be able to acquire these accents and be able to do a faithful portrayal of these characters, at least as far as language is concerned. We had very little time. I mean, generally, when you see actors, being up for awards for learning a foreign language or doing a flawless accent, they spend 6 months to a year at least learning that language or learning that accent. We had less than 2 months. So it was a very tall order, but then I'd be sitting there take after take, and if I closed my eyes and just listened to the dialogue, I would hear 2 Hasidic speakers from Williamsburg. It was incredible. So I'm certainly very, very proud of that fact. And there's so many scenes that were so complex and so difficult to stage and reenact. I mean, the wedding, obviously, so many moving parts, so many extras, most of whom were German. And we tried to the extent possible to use as many Jewish actors for the Jewish roles as possible. But as far as the extras were concerned, we needed hundreds. And we were filming in Berlin. So we invited the entire Jewish community of Berlin to participate in the wedding, but only so many responded to our calls. So the rest were German actors. In some cases, even German citizens that arrived from the Middle East, or whose parents came from the Middle East. The wedding hall was a Turkish wedding hall that catered to the local Palestinian community.
Wow.
And I wasn't surprised to discover that the aesthetic is the same for Palestinian weddings and Hasidic weddings. There was no air conditioning. So we had basically 200, 300 people counting the crew packed into this wedding hall, no ventilation, no air conditioning, people wearing 4 layers of wool Hasidic garments, fur hats. So it was an incredible feat. And we had 2 days to pull that off.
Who found it easier to learn the Yiddish? Was it the Germans or the Israelis?
Well, we didn't have, let me think for a second. We didn't have a single German actor playing a Yiddish speaking role. The German actors were all extras. We did have one English actor who played Leah, who played Alex, who played the mother. She had a few lines in Yiddish. But other than that, they were all pretty much European or Israeli or American Jews who had some exposure to Yiddish previously, except, of course, for our 2 leads, Shira and Amit, who, although Shira, as we all know, plays in Shtisel, she has no Yiddish lines in Shtisel, and she never had to learn Yiddish for that role. So, and this is the first time either of them acted in Yiddish, or spoke Yiddish for that matter. So, I mean, they, by all measures, did an absolutely incredible job.
When I think that scene, the wedding scene, which is very beautiful, but there's also, I guess, most of the scenes with showing the community have a darkness to them a little bit, right? It's conveyed both through, at least my point of view, from the lighting and from subject matter, and a lot of the scenes that are set in the world that SD is going towards are open scenes. There's a lot of light, there's expansion. From your experience, both on the set, but also coming from that world, is that how that world feels? Kind of constrained, darker, or?
Not at all. And I think that was more a projection of SD's own experiences. I mean, there's certainly a design choice. There was certainly a design choice made by the design team to portray well, first of all, to differentiate between the two worlds, between the Williamsburg world and the Berlin world. But it was more about Este's personal story and her own emancipation, and less an indictment of the Hasidic world in general. In fact, we did go to great pains to kind of portray the warmth and the beauty of the Hasidic world through its ceremonies, through its rituals, through its close-knit family structure. But of course, in Este's world, that family and that structure was very oppressive. But that is more a reflection of Este's personal experience than anything else. But there is this kind of fairy tale atmosphere and portrayal surrounding the Berlin elements that's lacking very much in the Williamsburg elements. Yes. But in my experience, I mean, I had a very happy childhood.
Were you Satmar? Did you grow up Satmar, or?
Not card carrying Satmar, no. I like to call it Satmar adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of this generic Hasidic Hungarian family with very strong ties to Satmar. My mother was born in a town 12 kilometers away from Satmar. My parents were both born in Hungary. And my grandparents studied in yeshivas that were ideologically akin to Satmar, so as did I myself. So certainly close enough for our purposes. But I had a very happy childhood and very loving parents, and I still have a wonderful relationship with them, which I thought might change after Unorthodox, but it hasn't. They did not necessarily appreciate the message of the show, but we're still very much on speaking terms. And
what is the message of the show?
Well, it's certainly different for me than it is for them. But I think the message for the show is that any system that does not allow for individuality and that does not allow for self-expression and personal autonomy is bound to create grief and injustice and inequity. I mean, that's and that we should all be the masters of our own fate, and we should all be able to choose the way in which we live our lives. And that's the universality of the show, and that's why it rings true all over the world. But of course, these notions of individuality and personal autonomy and control of our own bodies are completely foreign to the Hasidic way of life. If you would ask me to translate autonomy, personal autonomy into Hasidic terms, I'd be at a loss. I mean, the concepts are so foreign, they don't even translate. Because our bodies are not our own, our bodies are God's. I had this breakthrough in therapy once after I left, where the therapist told me, the therapist who was kind of a typical American unaffiliated Jew, a product of the hippie generation, and but she had a lot of, I guess, Orthodox or formerly Orthodox clients, and she said to me that Orthodox Jews see their bodies as a vehicle for their souls, and therefore are not present in their bodies. And as an actor, that's that's just an incredible truth to experience, because one of the hardest things for me to do as an actor was to be present in my body, and to be aware of my own body, and to be aware of my own space.
Did you try to convey that to the actors when they were learning how to be Hasidic? You know, try and remove yourself from being in your body and
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. But I think they also kind of arrived at that on their own. I mean, Shira already had that exposure from Shtisel, and although her character is very different, and she made specific character choices for Esti that were very different from your average Hasidic girl from Williamsburg, because Esti is different.
Can you give an example?
Kind of signal that difference. The way she walks, right? The way she walks and the way she talks, I would say. But the way she carries herself overall, there is a certain fierceness to it, a certain individuality to it. For one thing, Hasidic women walk with a sense of purpose and mission. Although, you know, I mean, you can't be too careful about that. That can be characterized as well. There's this tendency to portray Hasidic characters, certainly by non-Jewish actors, by reference to kind of religious, the religious types that they're familiar with. So they'll portray them like nuns almost. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's the wrong direction to take it as well. But there is this sense of mission, there is this sense of purpose. And, you know, Hasidic people, their posture will be more bowed. It'll be less nose up in the air. There is a very different awareness about your own posture. But I think it's a lot deeper than that. It's very subconscious, and it's about being present in your body or not being present in your body. And that's something that took me years to kind of incorporate into my own life and incorporate into my acting.
But then when you had to play Reb Yoselle, you had to retract and go back to an earlier place. Or...
But that's really easy. That's flicking a switch. I mean, at least as far as the physicality of it. That was the easiest part for me. The more difficult part is the motivation of the character, the personality of the character, because you, in a sense, the rabbi is the only real villain in the story. Everybody else is a victim of the system, and the rabbi kind of portrays the system itself. And the rabbi kind of is the puppet master behind the scenes and manipulates Moshe, certainly, uses him in a very, very cynical manner, knowing what he's capable of, knowing that his methods are unorthodox, and takes full advantage of that. But of course, you don't want to play a villain as a villain. You want to play him as a human being who thinks that his ends certainly justify the means, and that he acts on God's behalf, and his cause is just and righteous. And that's what he believes. That's what he truly believes. But so that's kind of the more complicated part of it for me. But usually the physicality kind of drives everything else for me, and is kind of where I start from. But in this case, it was kind of the reverse for me.
I mean, are there people in the Hasidic world? I mean, many of us have had contact with the world, but haven't lived in it as you have. But are there people who walk around and everybody thinks they're different? They're not acting the way everybody else is, or they're like Shira portrays a character. They've got a different mode, and people worry about them.
Absolutely. Well, I spent years kind of in a similar position myself. And over the last 8 years or so, when I kind of I should say, well, when I started the end of my journey away from the Hasidic community, because it all began really at or around my bar mitzvah. But in the beginning, it was very internal, my struggles involving faith. But then 8 years ago, I started actually, well, I left about 8 years ago. But there was this kind of interstitial period where I was part of these underground groups and blogs and Facebook groups. We'd get together and talk and hang out. And I got to meet so many wonderful people within the community that were lost between two worlds and couldn't leave because of their familial obligations, because of their professional ties to the community. They just stood too much to lose, or knew that they would lose access to their families, to their children. And so they live in this perennial limbo. And for me, that's
more men or more women? Who leaves more? It seems easier, at least from us, to think the men leave, easier for men to leave than for women.
So there is this mistaken notion, I think, that men are more likely to question and therefore leave. I don't think that's true at all. I think just men certainly have more opportunities to do so. For one thing, men are, much more autonomous. They disappear for hours every night to go to shul, but some of them end up going to bars or going to watch games, or just, guys' night out, or going to strip clubs, what have you. Whereas the women stay home with the children naturally. So men have a lot more opportunity to go out and explore, but they also are more likely to have a career. They're more likely to have access to a secular world, a secular society, and women are tied down. They're both tied down in some respect, but certainly women are much more so. So you encounter it less with women, but there's really very, very little way to know for certain. But I've certainly met my share of Hasidic women who presented as kind of law-abiding Hasidic women, but were incredibly well-read and well-educated, and wanted so much more out of life. But
is it received differently from the family? Do you think, if it's a man or a woman who leaves, is there a different reaction?
What really changes things is the presence of children. Beyond that, I don't think there's necessarily a different reaction whether it's a man or a woman who leaves once they've already left. The difference probably comes into play before they leave, when they start rebelling, right? A boy who starts wearing jeans and hanging out at night,
they're in trouble,
would be treated very differently from a girl who does the same. Absolutely. That double standard definitely exists. But I think that's only when they're still living at home, when they're still with the families. Once they truly leave, I don't think it really matters.
There's this experience to watching the movie of two worlds. There's a secular world, there's a Hasidic world, and so much the movie seems to be about Esti discovering the world that many of us take for granted, a world of freedoms, a world of friendships, of personal expression, of creativity, being able to be who you want to be. And I mean, you're an artist who went through a similar kind of journey in some ways, it sounds. So if there was one element of the wider world that you could bring into the Hasidic community that you come from, without blowing the whole world up, without turning it completely on its head. But you thought if we could give you this one element that would help people inside feel better, it would create a better relationship. What would that one element be?
Well, everything would have really far-reaching, any kind of change would have really far-reaching effects. So there are many different directions one can go in. I mean, you can say choice, personal freedom, but it's a very big word. But what does that actually mean? I think ultimately it comes down to education, and a good friend of mine, Nick Moster, started an organization called Yafed, which is doing tremendous work to basically compel the New York State Board of Education to enforce the existing standards under the New York State Constitution, that religious schools or private schools provide a substantially equal education to those of the public schools. And the fact of the matter is that they don't even pay lip service to it. At best, you have an hour to an hour and a half a day of all kind of general subjects. And in practice, it's a joke. It's basically seen as free time. And the teachers that are hired are completely helpless to try to teach the children anything, because it's after they've already sat for 7-8 hours and studied the Talmud. And they have no patience left for learning anything, much less general subjects that they are taught are unimportant at best and heretical at worst. So they receive virtually no secular education, which means they're hampered at any even if they wanted to go out and have a real career and have a real profession and continue their education, there are so many obstacles laid in their path. The first of which being that their English might be, as an adult, might be 3rd grade level, maybe 5th grade level. And their knowledge of really anything from history to, forget about earth sciences or any sciences really. It's abysmal. So if they had a real education, that would open the door to so much opportunity that doesn't exist because of that.
But then would there be an exodus of people leaving if they opened that door, right?
Perhaps. I mean, there certainly would be more people
That's
leaving.
their fear, probably.
Now, I don't think it would fall apart. I just think that, I mean, that's part of the problem, right? They live in this kind of totalitarian, well, universe where they believe that it's their way or nothing. Theirs is the only way to God. Theirs is the only way to heaven, and that's the problem. There's absolutely no tolerance of dissent, and personally, I think if there is tolerance for dissent, you would be creating a much more powerful platform, a much more powerful message, and more people might be staying out of their own volition. Whereas now you have a very large percentage, I would say, that are just kind of going through the motions. What some people refer to as orthoprax. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Mm-hmm. Where you follow halacha simply because you have no other choice. it's actually exceedingly difficult to live a non-halachic lifestyle in the Hasidic community. I mean, when nobody's looking, you can flick the switch on Shabbos up and down. But as far as an actual lifestyle goes, you don't really have access to non-kosher food. You don't have access to non-kosher entertainment. You live in your own completely self-contained universe. So most people are Orthodox simply because that's the world they live in. They don't
walking around. So you're walking around, and you might be doing it, but you don't have the faith. You don't have the emunah, and you're probably wondering how many other people are there like me around me who are living like this, and how do you? Even if are you thinking in your mind, even when you're maybe 11, 12, maybe you're too young, how am I going to get the skills if I do want to leave to live in the outside world? Do you think there are organizations who can help you, or you just think I got to get out like Esti does?
Well, there are organizations now that can help you. Absolutely. There's Freedom that I'm on the board of. There's Footsteps that I'm a member of. There are lots of organizations that are providing a very vital literally life-saving service. I have many friends who swear that their lives were saved because of these organizations, in a very literal sense. And I mean, that's part of the problem. The problem is that there is no awareness of the outside world. So you wouldn't even be aware of these organizations' existence.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you were aware of it, you might think, the propaganda that you receive in the community is that an organization like Footsteps, their mission is to turn all Jews into apostates, which is absurd on so many levels. But yeah, I mean, like I said, this concept of autonomy and choice doesn't exist. It's you're either with us or you're against us. You're either Jewish or you're not. There is no gray area. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for self-expression.
I'd like to explore the other side for a minute, which is there's obviously a lot to be critical about, and the show demonstrates that through Esti's life, which is, as you said, a particular circumstance. But there is a moment where they even ask her mother, is there anything you miss? And she says, of course, there's stuff I miss. And this is living in Berlin as a lesbian woman. And she said, of course, there's stuff I still miss from the community. So I throw that question back at you. Is there anything that you miss from that community? Or do you ever think, I wish the secular world, to speak, if we want to call it that, has some of those elements? Or what can be, what's the fertilization that could happen the other direction?
We can call it the free world because that's what they call it.
Interesting.
In Yiddish, we call, non-Hasidic Jews or non-Orthodox Jews, we call free, literally. Of course, it's used pejoratively, but, and that's what Freida means. Frei is Yiddish for free. And it's kind of a play on that. So, absolutely, there are things that I miss. For one thing, I miss my faith. That was probably the single most traumatic event in my life, was realizing that I didn't believe in God. And before then, I had such an intense personal relationship with God. So that was a terrible loss. But I also miss this sense of community, this sense of belonging. I miss davening when it meant something to me. For me, the practice was always incredibly meditative and transcendent. I miss the music very much, and I still very much engage with the music. I mean, I was always, my favorite genre of music is cantorial music. and I still listen to it a lot. But right. But and the Hasidic philosophy, because that for me was always the real draw, the real attraction. I was a very kind of devoted student of Hasidic texts, and I spent some time in Chabad for that reason. I was drawn to their Hasidic philosophy, and I studied Kabbalah. I studied kind of different areas of Jewish thought.
Now, do you still have a feeling for any of that?
It's not the same. It's not the same when you don't really believe in it. I mean, I try to. Well, I what I do enjoy now is things like biblical criticism, and reading it as a work of literature, reading it as kind of an important Jewish historical document, and so on and so forth. But it's not the same. It's not transcendent. But I do find that, for me at least, I think I've managed to fill that void with art, because that's essentially what it is. I mean, to me, religion is art on so many levels. I think I have this conversation sometimes with atheist friends. If you can push a button and get rid of religion, would you do that? And I like to say absolutely not. I think religion is of equal importance to art, in the sense that you certainly wouldn't kill anybody over art. But at the same time, it drives and motivates and beautifies our existence. So for me, theater is religion. Being on stage for me is going to shul.
Maybe a final question before we open up it. Is there any chance of that world wanting to understand the fry world the way there's a desire on the other side, or is it too dangerous, too much too much heretical thought, and there's too much threat? Or do you think people do want to understand other Jews, conservative Jews, modern Orthodox Jews, or is it all treif?
Yeah, I mean, it's all treif. I mean, I should qualify this and say that things are much better today than they were when I was growing up, in the sense that there is more opportunity to kind of create your own style of Hasidic Judaism. There's this kind of whole neo-Hasidic movement. I mean, there are a lot of people within the Hasidic communities that are fed up with the current status quo and are liberalizing and are finding room for self-expression, creating their own kind of satellite communities. And people who lead normal lives, who consume popular entertainment, who have careers and engage in kind of popular culture, but they still maintain a lot of the cultural elements of Hasidic life. You know, they'll still wear their shtreimel on Shabbos, maybe. They'll still eat their cholent and eat their kugel and go to shul and do all those things, and kind of creating this reality where they manage to dance at both weddings, as they say in Yiddish. But
they don't want to give up the kugel or the cholent.
Exactly. Because you can have your kugel and eat it too.
Uh-huh.
And
if you're discovered, I mean, are there a few Hasidic sects that are probably more that would allow such a lifestyle if they didn't see it? Probably not Satmar, but maybe others
certainly
would.
not. I mean, certainly not fundamentally. Not. I mean, there's certainly some Hasidic groups that might be more tolerant of it because they see it as the lesser of two evils. At least these people are still keeping something. They're still keeping some form of kosher. They're still keeping some form of Shabbos. And they're not completely becoming assimilated. So they see it certainly as the lesser of two evils. But then there are those who see it as the worst possible outcome. They'd rather you leave entirely than kind of corrupt the integrity of their community. So there are two schools of thought there. But I think largely I hate to say this, but they have a point. I mean, if you look at the numbers, every other movement, every other denomination, every other community has a really high attrition rate. And the ultra-Orthodox are the only ones that manage to retain their traditions from one generation to the next. So they do it because it works. Not giving your children an education that gives them other options, dressing in traditional garb, speaking Yiddish, it works. And they're very aware of that. And they're very aware that once they allow the outside world into their community, the floodgates will open.
Very interesting for me to hear you talking about the neo-Hasidic world, because many of us are more familiar with what is a neo-Hasidic world, the world of singing the melodies, which are part of regular synagogue life probably, and all kind. And those communities are more part of the Fry world than the traditional Hasidic world in many ways. And I sometimes ask myself, even, is there a connection? Is there really a connection even between a neo-Hasidic and the Hasidic? It's hard to even see the connection sometimes. Beyond the text, the basic text of the Baal Shem Tov and the first generations.
Yeah, because what happened was the Hasidic community of today has strayed so far afield from what the Baal Shem Tov actually taught and intended. It really became, it went from being this very populist
revolutionary
movement to becoming this, I don't know what to call it, but this very authoritarian and very elitist movement in a sense. So it really turned it on its head. And the Baal Shem Tov would not recognize the Hasidic world of today at all. So in that respect, you're absolutely right. They're unrecognizable. But I think the kind of the new neo-Hasidic movement that's arising within the Hasidic community itself, in some respect, is returning to its roots. And they're making it more about the love and the spirituality and the love for your fellow Jew, love for your fellow man, and love for the common man, really, more than anything else. And there are some movements within. I mean, there's a resurgence of, or rather, I should probably call it insurgence of Breslov thought in the Satmar community. There's a Breslov yeshiva that's cropped up that started basically as a last resort, as a school for wayward boys. they were taking pretty much everybody that everybody else had given up on, which is the only way these parents would agree to sending their kids to a Breslov institution, where they encourage, they create art, they play instruments, they make music, they write their own songs in Yiddish. They spend a lot of time singing, rather, their entire day poring over Talmudic tomes. So there is some of that happening within Satmar itself, where people are finding alternatives, and obviously that's a very good thing. I'm all for it, and the more forms of self-expression that they find, there's this whole artistic renaissance happening in the Hasidic community as well. When I was growing up in Borough Park, there were very few outlets in terms of literature, in terms of certainly media didn't exist. But now you have Hasidic films, you have Hasidic music videos, you have Hasidic novels, you have Hasidic comic books. If it exists in the outside world, it exists in the Hasidic world.
How about Hasidic video games?
Well, no, but Hasidic board games, certainly. They're making Hasidic toys and Hasidic board games. I haven't seen video games, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens at some point. I figure if somebody Hasidic has become involved in the gaming community, they're already online, they're already accessing everything that's available out there. So I don't know that they'll be that interested in a Hasidic alternative at that point, but you never know.
Thank you. Well, very interesting and a hopeful place to leave the beginning of our conversation about the movement within that world to try and open up and return to the original spirit, as you mentioned. I'm heartened to hear that. So I'd like to open it up for questions. And I'm going to read a few questions that were in the chat. And I know a few other people wanted to ask questions. You can also unmute yourself. So if you have a question, you could either send it to me privately in the chat, or you can just send it to everyone. So first one is from Barb Young. My question, was it intentional that they leave open the question of whether Yankee and the Hasidic community could try to take the baby, just like they took Esti from her mom? Because it never quite resolved that. Would they have taken the baby or not? Was that intentionally left open, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, intentionally, as in, well, the ending was intentionally left ambiguous, certainly, because that's always more interesting than feeding the ending to you, feeding the answer to you. But also, I mean, if the question is, was it to allow for a second season? Well, first let's get that out of the way. I mean, if you don't already know, there won't be a second season. This is it. It was always imagined as a limited series. The story has been told, the story of Esti leaving anyway. The story of what happens once she has already joined that world and successfully left is a lot less interesting. As far as the child goes, I mean, that's, I think, very accurate in terms of reflecting what happens in real life, because when you do have children and you do leave behind children, the story's never over. That connection is never severed. And I have so many friends who are dealing with custody issues, 20 years out. That battle never ends. So I think that in that respect, it's not ambiguous at all. It makes a very, very strong and an important point.
In my mind, I link it as well to the gun which Moshe brings, which shows their determination to bring the will of the community over this situation.
Right, and I've seen some talk from people saying that that's inauthentic, that would never happen. Well, putting aside the question of whether it would happen in real life or not, and it absolutely could happen. But the gun is very symbolic, right? It's symbolic of that. First of all, that hold, that stranglehold that the community has on your life, but also on the fact that, like I said, so many people whose lives were saved by these organizations, other people were not as lucky, and ended up taking their own lives because of being completely cut off by your family and not having any support system. So I think that's very symbolic when he hands you the gun and says, "You'll do it to yourself." Of course, it's metaphorical and it's figurative, but it can also be literal. And that is what we're taught in the community, that your life is here, and as soon as you leave, your life will end. Whether it's because of crime or drugs or STDs or what have you, you're only safe here. And once you leave, anything can happen to you.
Slightly question coming from a slightly different place, but one which I think many of us wonder and think about, which is why hold on to some of the traditions, such as the way to dress? I mean, why walk around? Why go on the bus in Jerusalem in the middle of the summer wearing the garb? Why in New York City? Why is that part of tradition? So why has that become part of the tradition? Why can't there be some flexibility with that?
There's an old Yiddish expression. It's the Yiddish version of the butterfly effect. And that is that when a chassid in bells takes off his long black socks, a Reformed Jew in Paris will convert to Christianity. And that is what they truly believe. There's a saying in the Talmud that whenever there's a fundamental crisis of religion, whether it's a government decree trying to micromanage, trying to impose its own values on your religious life or what have you, then all bets are off. So normally in Judaism, of course, we're all familiar with the fact that the Torah says that you shall live with them, that mitzvot are only incumbent on you to the extent that they don't interfere with your life, and life comes before everything, and pikuach nefesh. But there are times, according to the Talmud, when even the smallest minhag, when even the smallest custom, if the very tenets of your religion are at stake, then even those become inviolable, even at the threat of death. And Hasidic people take that quite literally. You want to change us, you want to bend us to your will, we would rather go to our deaths than change who we are. And they really believe that if they change their garments, that's the beginning of the slippery slope. And like I said, the proof is in the pudding. It works. Their retention rate is very high. And that's one of the reasons, because if you're saddled with this garb, you are self-isolating. You're distancing yourself from other people around you, and cutting off whatever influence they would normally have on you. So you're not befriending your neighbors, you're not being influenced by their culture, and you're reinforcing your own otherness, you're reinforcing your persecution complex, you're reinforcing the sense that you are different from them. And that builds the walls of your self-created ghetto all the higher because of it.
That was a big part of the movie, references to the Holocaust and to persecution of Jews. And um, was that brought in for dramatic effect? Was that part of the script that was already there? Were you part of bringing that? I know for some they felt it struck them as a little bit maybe overly, it's as if in that community all you talk about all day long is the Shoah. And the maybe a broader question, which is why the changes from the book mainly to make the show more dramatic, or were there kind of deeper philosophic?
Whenever you turn a book into a movie, you have to make a lot of changes just because of the nature of the art form. I mean, books tend to be mostly built on inner narratives. And of course, you can't watch an inner narrative on the screen. So that has to be translated somehow into action, into something that's cinematic. And I mean, that's why, for example, they changed, whereas Deborah is a writer, Esty is a musician or a singer. Because watching somebody write, it's incredibly uncinematic. I mean, imagine, what would even be the equivalent of the audition scene if she were a writer? So yes, obviously a lot of the changes were made for artistic reasons, but also we wanted it to be fictional. We wanted it to be universalized. We wanted to make certain changes from Deborah's story. And it was also a vehicle for the creators of the show, for Anna and Alexa, who are both Berlin Jews. Alexa was born and raised there and now lives in LA. Anna was actually from New York, but she lives in Berlin now. And they both wanted to, originally they set out to tell the story about what it is to be a Jew in Berlin today. And that was the story they originally wanted to tell. And then they met Deborah. And they decided that her story was a perfect vehicle to tell this story. And that's why they brought Esty to Berlin right away, as opposed to Deborah, who gets there many years later. Because it was a German story. They set out to tell a German story. And of course, I mean, for practical reasons, it was a German production after all. We were going to shoot it in Berlin. So we needed the bulk of the action to take place in Berlin. And a lot of the Holocaust references that come in Berlin, that whole scene in the car where they're making these casual flippant remarks about Holocaust tourism and about all the monuments and about the lake, that is more a reflection of the writers and their own experiences in Berlin, rather than Esty's or Deborah's. As for the references to the Holocaust that are in Williamsburg, which really only the Seder scene comes to mind, right? That is exactly when it would be referenced. I mean, we didn't walk around all day, every day talking about the Holocaust, but at times like the Seder, I mean, that is when you would talk about it. But it always loomed, especially when I was growing up. I'm guessing it's less so today, but all four of my grandparents were survivors. My mother's parents were both in Auschwitz, both lost their respective first spouses and children at Auschwitz, and then met and married in a DP camp afterward and started fresh. So I very much lived in that shadow, and was raised in the trauma of children of survivors of the Holocaust. It's probably less true today as we're kind of another generation removed. But the Hasidic community see their life's mission, their goal, their community as a direct response to the Holocaust. Everything they do is a direct response to the Holocaust. It's, revenge against Hitler. So in that respect, I think it's a very, very accurate portrayal.
Thank you. We have a question from our cantor, Figa, who is a Yiddishist. So maybe, Cantor, do you want to ask your question in Yiddish?
Ich kann nicht reden, also ich geht, aber ich habe a pur kashes, shilas. Well, a question that I had when you were, by the way, fantastic presentation. A pleasure to hear you and meet you. When you were religious, growing up, were you exposed to the classic secular Yiddish literature? And eventually, I assume you have. What was that a revelation for you? Did you? What were your feelings when you were exposed to Shalom Aleichem or the Singer Brothers? Or
I might have heard about Shalom Aleichem, but that's pretty much the extent of it. I do recall discovering a Yiddish section at the Brooklyn Public Library, but it was very difficult for me to read and relate to that at the time. Our Yiddish is very different growing up, and of course, my Yiddish was much closer to that because, again, a generation ago, the Yiddish was much less intermixed with English. We kind of prided ourselves in speaking a pure Yiddish, but it was still very different. It was much more Deutschmanisch, much more Hungarian, much less Slavic. Virtually no Slavisms. And if you open up a Shalom Aleichem or a Mendel Moiches Svarim or a Yitzchak Bashevis, it's chock full of Slavisms and words that I never would have heard of growing up. But we were aware of a world of maskilim, of enlightenment out there, and to us that was heresy, that was blasphemy. I know we had no access to it. We had no access to it. I was more likely to read Charles Dickens than I was to read Shalom Aleichem growing up. And when I discovered that when I first got involved with Yiddish theater 4 years ago, and I was blown away. I was absolutely blown away because these people took a very similar journey to my own. They grew up in the Hasidic world. They grew up in this traditional world. They went to yeshiva, some of them. I'm reading Chaim Grada now. I'm reading Tzemach Atlas, the yeshiva, in Yiddish. And it's just mind-blowing. I mean, this world and these characters are so familiar to me. And in some respect, I feel like I was deprived of that growing up. But it's absolutely wonderful, and it's one of the reasons why I have found this new home for me in this world of Yiddish art and Yiddish theater.
Very nice. I wonder if you have any religious people who secretly come to see your theater productions. Back in the 80s, I did several productions at Town Hall. I did Oi Mama bin ich verliebt and Der Jiddische Zigeunerker, Ashidach von Himmel, all of these almost Schun's plays. And I would walk into 42nd Street Photo, which was run by Hasids, and they would recognize me. This is the place that I was a star. They said, "Oh, you're the guy." So, how about you? Did you do people, religious people, come to your theatrical productions?
Yes, much less than I would have hoped for. but yes, they come. They kind of sneak in as the curtain goes up, and when the lights are down, and they sit in the back row, and they are gone as soon as the curtain goes down. But some of them are friends that I know from within the community, and they eat the stuff up. They absolutely love it. I mean, there's such a hunger for real art, and there's such a lack of it. But as I said, hopefully, I mean, things are getting better in the sense that as the community continues to grow and modernize in some respects, there's this whole new burgeoning art world within the community, which the more the better. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very nice. Azoy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cantor.
Thank you. Well, maybe one or two more questions. I have one question which came up in my chat, which was, we're going back a little bit to where we were talking about the Hasidic world and what it's like. But is there access to healthcare there? For example, a mammogram or mental health professionals, or is that stuff available?
Well, healthcare, absolutely. I mean, they have their own health centers. They're very active within the local Jewish hospital system. They have very, very wonderful Bikur Cholim societies. One thing, actually, I guess perhaps one of my regrets is not doing more to portray their overwhelming amount of chesed, of charity work performed by the Satmar community. It's ironic because they're all, I shouldn't say all, but a very large majority of them are strong supporters of the current administration and card-carrying Republicans right now. But their own community is incredibly socialist. Incredibly socialist. I mean, they have the best safety net. Nobody goes hungry. Nobody's homeless. Nobody's without health care. Everybody is provided for. And they have organizations that pick up the slack wherever the government leaves off. There's a society for every imaginable need out there. Whether it's bridal wear, whether it's, cribs, maternity needs, all kinds of health needs for the family. There's a lending society out there for it. Mental health is another issue altogether. It's still very much stigmatized. There's more awareness around it now, but it's still an uphill battle because part of the structure of control that the Hasidic community holds on you is the shidduch system, the matchmaking system, because everything is so dependent on your reputation and standing within the community. Your whole life is structured that way. Literally from the cradle, your parents are already worried about the kind of match you're going to make because that dictates your future. It dictates everything from your livelihood to, your profession, your standing in the community. And it has this ripple effect. The first match they make affects the second match and so on and so forth. So nobody wants to do anything that'll make them stand out in a negative way. Nobody wants to look different. Nobody wants to act different. This need for conformity is incredibly strong. And so any kind of stigma, even something that's not mental health related, but rather biological, whether it's forget about anything genetic. I mean, they're terrified of that. Because if there's any whisper of any kind of genetic problem in the family, nobody would want to marry into that family. But yes, the stigma of mental health is incredibly high, and people are afraid to get the proper care because of it.
Thank you. Last question, maybe from Alan, and a question I relate to as well. He asked you about your own voyage from a Chassid to law school, a legal career, and then into theater. Now thinking my own journey from law school to legal career to being a writer and a journalist, then being a rabbi. So slightly different paradigm. If you could address that in a few minutes.
Yeah, there was a time when I thought of being a rabbi as well. Definitely going to rabbinical school and law school are in many ways very complementary. Require a certain set of complementary skills and so on. I don't know. I don't think I grew up wanting to be a lawyer. There was a time when my parents thought I would be a rabbi. And then something happened at some point. I realized I was married. I needed to support a family. And with my yeshiva education, law school was really the only option. I think my parents were all too pleased about that. And they were very upset when I gave that up to become an actor. For me, I spend the better part of my life kind of searching and trying to find a place where I felt I was being true to myself. And, I started out in this very Hungarian Hasidic community. I went to Lithuanian yeshivot. I went to Chabad. I studied Kabbalah. I certainly felt I left no stone unturned. And then ultimately, I guess I realized there was no magic 8-ball. There was no answer out there for me. And I kind of became comfortable in this kind of modern Hasidic, modern Orthodox lifestyle. I went to law school. I got very busy in this corporate career. I didn't have too much time to think. And that led me into my 30s, at which point I had, I guess, an early midlife crisis. And all my questions from my adolescence, all my doubts, they all came back with a vengeance. And my first step was to leave the Hasidic community and my marriage at the time. And then one day I found myself in my law office thinking, I made so many sacrifices to live my truth, to be happy. But I was afraid of giving up my legal career because I was afraid of, the sunk cost fallacy. And I was afraid to take that last step in my life that I thought was necessary for my own happiness, for my own well-being. And then when I realized that, I just realized it was the only way to justify everything I did up to that point and to truly be happy. And I haven't looked back.
What's in the future?
I don't want to be necessarily the Hollywood's Yiddish consultant for the rest of my life. First of all, I don't think it's a very stable career choice. These things, come and go. I don't think there will be Yiddish shows and Yiddish films forever. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life playing a rabbi. I'd like to take on other challenging roles that are maybe more distant from my own reality. So we'll see, but probably some combination of writing and acting.
I think we'll end here, and just want to thank you again for being so open and sharing your life and your role in the series, bringing that whole world into more focus for us and answering questions that we all have about it. And in these few days before Tisha B'Av, giving us a glimpse of the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic world. And I was, maybe to return to one of the aspects that you shared, that there's movement within even the Satmar community to create a new opening, which I hadn't heard before, which I found hopeful. So thank you again for being with us this morning and for your fascinating talk and for all of it. Thank you to the Herkes family for sponsoring today's talk. And best of luck with all of your future projects. And too bad that there's not going to be another Unorthodox, but maybe we'll see you in another Netflix program soon. And maybe as a final thought, as we go into these days before Tisha B'Av, for all, to keep our hearts open to other Jews and other people in our midst to look different or seem different, and to be open to our drive towards freedom and to self-expression, which is a lot of what I heard from you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Great.
And maybe one day we'll do these things in person.
That sounds good. Sounds good. Goodbye, shalom, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.